So one of the things you're going to notice immediately, I don't know how many of you all are familiar with the childhood show Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the others. One of these things just doesn't belong. That would be this presentation in this session. But we'll get to privacy at the end of it. But it's going to be something completely different than Jost's presentation right now. As Robin mentioned, the Internet Society has been looking at trust and identity for quite a while, and in recent years we've also taken a look at the Internet of Things aspects of it. And in this audience, it goes without saying that I've always struggled with the concept of Internet of Things, because to me it's still the Internet. It's just bigger and scarier and has lots more things on it, but it's still really the Internet. And we can talk about how the Internet of Things is changing things, but it's an evolution. It's not a new Internet. It's not something that's new and different. However, it is getting a lot more press and getting a lot more attention, and in recent years we've heard a lot of news about the problems that the Internet of Things is bringing to us. The more devices that we have out there, the cheaper these devices are, the more unmanaged and forgotten about they are, the more risks that they bring. So we have all of these new devices and some really old devices with new vulnerabilities. And they present sort of some new and unique security challenges compared to traditional computing systems. I would say that they, again, they're an evolution. It's not something that's completely different, but it is, it's at a scale and a complexity that the cybersecurity community doesn't really quite have the capacity to deal with. And so I do think we need to think a little bit out of the box about how can we deal effectively with this sort of wave of issues that we're getting, because cybersecurity professionals, and they don't multiply overnight. And I think one of the challenges that we've seen, if you look at some of the academic work in several years ago, the academics were talking about how to build better security code. And now what they're really talking about is how do we build those toolkits that we can give to all those developers out there, because we can't make all of those developers security experts. So I think what we're really talking about is how do we motivate that improvement. The other thing about IoT security is it's both inward-facing and outward-facing. It's the harm to our own systems, but also the harm that our systems can do to other systems. And you look at some of the incidents that we've seen over the last few years, and you see that these that we have seen examples of both of these. So how do we improve things? Well, I think that there's some basic aspects of how we make the world better, or how we make this environment better, that have been known to us for a long time. I think the first one is research and innovation. If you just look at Jost's presentation, a number of the presentations you'll see here this week, a lot of innovation and research starts in this community, and it moves forward from here. Open standards, I think we heard in the keynote this morning about the importance of standards. I mean, she was talking about all of the different programmers, and none of them were interoperable, and there's a big cart full of them. And I mean, there were a number of things in her presentation that were terrifying, but that was one of them. Somebody who, I come from the standards world, I've been working on standards for a long time, and that whole concept of the lack of standards in this space is interesting. And then frameworks and best practices. I think the operational community has long looked at best practices. You can look at some of the, from a networking perspective, you look at RIPE and some of those organizations, and the IETF from more of a standards perspective, have always recognized the importance of best practices and communicating those best practices out to the community in general. Certifications and trademarks. There are a number of examples through history where certifications have been very effective. If you think of the Wi-Fi Alliance and some of those things. There's also a few examples where they haven't been quite as successful. It tends to be a very resource intensive activity, so you really need to be sure you've got the right certifications and the right trust marks at the right times. And finally, policy and regulation. So I come from the United States, and I'm not sure there's too many countries in the world that are more policy or regulation averse than the US. But I think there's a number of people that have come to the point now where we're saying, it is time for some intelligent regulation in this space. It's time for some accountability, some proper accounting of liability. So there's a bunch of work to be done. And before we start doing this work, I'd like to take a moment and pause and look back and say, okay, we've got this problem, we've got all of these things that we want to do to solve it, but we also don't want to forget the basic invariants that the internet has brought to us. Its basic characteristics that have allowed it to evolve to the point that it is today, and the type of characteristics that we would like to see going forward. This was a concept articulated by the Internet Society. There's nothing dramatic and new there, but it's been sort of one of our guiding principles for a long time. There are some basic invariants in the internet, and that we want to see in a global open internet. Our mission has always been to encourage the development and evolution of a strong open internet that's global. And we're sort of in challenging times associated with that, but I think we do like to take a step back and say, what are some of these core invariants? Global reach and integrity. I think that's a key one in this space. We have a global network that we need to be able to trust, and there's a number of aspects that lead to that. Collaboration, and we're going to be talking in a number of different sessions this week about collaboration and the importance of collaboration and how that's one of the keys to getting things done going forward. Interoperability and mutual agreement. Again, this is something that I think we have a shared interest in these open standards, and we have a shared interest in strong technical solutions that are then adopted and moved forward. And I'm not going to go through the rest of these, but as we start moving forward in this space, we do need to every so often take a step back and say, well, these are the basic characteristics that we want to preserve going forward. So I'm going to take a very quick moment to, I don't know how many of you have seen this, but as somebody who's worked in the standard space, this is a cartoon that's been around for a long time. And one of the real challenges with standards is, of course, there are so many. And having recently, in a working group that I chair, gotten really frustrated and said, I don't care I don't care being a strong word, but basically there's a balance between too many standards, which is negative, but there's also a balance in the standards community waiting to develop the perfect standard and waiting and waiting and waiting. And at some point, I was arguing with somebody and I was like, I don't care if we have two standards in this place. I am ready to have something out there and let the market decide, because the market will eventually decide. Look at VHS and Betamax. It's sort of your stereotypical example of it. Eventually the market will decide. I have some Betamax tapes at home that I can do nothing with. Of course, I can't do anything with the VHS tapes now either, but that's another story. The VHS lasted a tad longer. But there are an enormous number of standards activities ongoing right now in the IoT space. And I'm not going to call any of these out specifically, but you can look to your favorite standards organization, and undoubtedly you will find some standard work going on in the IoT space. In particular, as it relates to some stuff that we're particularly interested in, I think the IETF efforts related to software updates are interesting and have some real promise, and they are indirectly referenced in some of the things going forward. So these are some of the standards activities that are in this space. The next thing is frameworks. And part of what motivated this talk originally was in some ways you think, what can NRENs do in the IoT space? And, from the Internet Society perspective, we don't operate any networks. We don't run in the NREN space, but we do look at NRENs and we say, they are a community that has always been sort of at the leading edge of networks. And they're a community to look to for best practices. And they're also a community that we can use to help leverage some of these activities. So in any event, the Online Trust Alliance a number of years ago, I think it was roughly 2015, went and they looked at a IoT security and privacy framework, and they wanted it to be principles versus standards. It's really focused on consumer-grade devices, and so it's really, to a large extent, focused on manufacturers of those devices and what kinds of characteristics we'd like to see in those devices. It talks about known vulnerabilities and IoT threats, and it's intended to be actionable and vendor neutral. So there is this OTA, IoT privacy and trust framework, and there are a number of frameworks out there, and we have this conversation internal to the Internet Society about, is this the right framework? Is it the perfect framework? And I would take you back to my conversation a minute ago about, at some point you just got to decide on one and move forward. And I think this one is solidly developed, and we're moving forward with it. And the Online Trust Alliance was originally, and I don't speak for the Online Trust Alliance in case I get any of this wrong. I should have said at the very beginning of this, by the way, this represents the work of a number of folks from the Internet Society. Everything that I get right is to their credit, and everything that I get wrong is all me. We ended up, the Online Trust Alliance ended up becoming an Internet Society initiative, and so it is still to a certain extent, a separate activity or a separate initiative within the Internet Society, but it is closely aligned with our activities. So they developed this trust framework. Now, I promise you I am not going to step through the trust framework, just in case you get nervous. Going back one step, it's divided into 4 key areas. There's security principles, there's user access and credentials, privacy, disclosure, and transparency, notifications, and related best practices. So basically, it's a big checklist where things are required or recommended. And the intention is that you can use this to help purchase devices, or you can use this to help manufacture devices to get them aligned with what you would like them to be. And as you see, there's a whole line of security ones here. And I would call your attention to the middle of the items like 6 and 7, where we're really talking about updates and patches. I think that's something we've seen in recent years. It's been a real issue is, we get these devices, they go out in the field, and they stay there, and there's no way to update them. And then they get leveraged to do something unpleasant and not exactly what we would like to see. So from a security, devices, apps, and cloud services perspective, these are some of them. And then in my promise to say that I wasn't going to read this to you, I'm just going to show you roughly what we're talking about here. There's some aspects related to user access and credentials. There's some privacy and disclosure and transparency. And then since I put the first ones up, I felt I might as well put the rest of them up as well. So you can either be terrified by the length of the document, or you can say, oh, that's not so bad. So I would strongly encourage anybody who's interested to take a look at this document. In addition to that, there's a much shorter, just a one-pager, Enterprise IoT Security Checklist, which was released earlier this year. And this was something that was viewed just to focus specifically on enterprises and helping enterprises to have a very basic checklist of items that they could use moving forward. So who's responsible? And this is where we get back to collaboration and sort of a collective community type of approach here. We need a collective approach that addresses security's challenges on all fronts. And where do NRENs fit in? Well, when you start doing the checks, there's a lot of NRENs in there. And for what it's worth, I know that there's 2 retailers and resellers there, and I didn't notice that until the very end. You never notice mistakes in your slides until the very last second. So we have a lot of retailers and resellers, apparently. We need a lot of critical mass here. So in thinking about this ecosystem, it occurred to me that NRENs are consumers because they buy a lot of devices. They are also operators because they build networks and they operate those networks, and they deal with the impact that all of the devices that their customers are bringing onto their networks. To a certain extent, they're policymakers because you make the rules for your environments. You are policymakers. And you are developers in a sense that you're innovators. And we've seen an example of that in this session already, in that you bring new technologies in. And finally, you're technical leaders, and I'll get to that a little bit more later as to what I'm talking about here. So, so what are some of the possible NREN roles and actions? Well, the first one is, since you're consumers, you can exercise your procurement power. So when you go out to buy things, you can use that checklist or another checklist like it to ensure that the devices that you are getting are moving in the direction of being safer for your environment. Individually, you may not think you have much procurement power and sway over manufacturers, but as a community and as a collective, you actually do. And so that's one way that NRENs can participate in this process. The second one is to operators, you can build smartly. Well, obviously you do build smartly, but you could, as you're building these networks, you can think about the tools, the settings, the policies that would help you both protect yourself from the devices that are brought on and also protect the rest of the world from what the devices on your network might do. So what types of settings would you want to set? What types of filters do you want to set? Those kinds of things. So your policy, it's really hard to come up with short, pithy things. So rule wisely. I think that's everybody should rule wisely, right? But as operators of networks, you do rule your network. And so you create the rules upon which people can be on that network. And creating a set of rules that help clean up the ecosystem is a very positive thing. And also getting the rules that you have in place and sharing those with your neighbors under the terms of best operational practices. Here are the rules that you can put in. Here are the rules that we put in place for these reasons. Developers implement cautiously. And I found it fascinating earlier, the question about, has the crypto been peer reviewed? This is the kind of thing we're talking about. Are we carefully evaluating the crypto that we're using? Are we using open source? Are we double checking? Are we triple checking? Those kinds of things. And finally, as technical leaders participate, and there's a lot of different ways you can participate. You can participate in the standards organizations. You can participate in policy development at the regional and global level. Because you have experience and you have a perspective, that would be excellent in this space. So finally, because this is a enhancing privacy and IoT session, I did not have privacy, I don't think, anywhere in the abstract I submitted, but that's okay. There is a large aspect of privacy in the framework document that I talked about earlier. There are some basic challenges in privacy. I want to reference a couple resources that I think you might find helpful. This is hot off the press, and we at the Internet Society had the honor of having one of the authors speak to us about a week ago, or just a week ago now. This is 150 pages or 151 pages. It is a very comprehensive look at the issue of privacy and the Internet of Things. I would strongly suggest that you read it. The second one is, if you are involved at all in policy discussions, there is a policy security for IoT security for policymakers document, which I would also strongly encourage people to take a look at. Finally, a couple more Internet Society resources I wanted to point to, the Internet of Things overview and the policy paper. So for some final thoughts here, the Internet of Things is here and it's growing. So I think we need to be wary, but not afraid. I think NRENs in particular are uniquely positioned. And I haven't heard as much conversation this time, but and it seems to me like last year or the year before at TNC, there was a fair amount of conversation about what is the role of NRENs in the world. Is it changed? I mean, the way university networks are done and now has evolved quite a bit from in the last 20 years, obviously. It's a much more operationalized, it's much less experimental, if you want to use that term. But I still think NRENs are uniquely positioned to help lead the way forward because you have a chance to experiment with things, you have a chance to try new things in a way that your average company enterprise network is never going to do. So finally, Use your NREN superpowers to buy, build, rule, implement, and participate in the emerging IoT ecosystem. A couple quick acknowledgements. Steve Olshansky, who's in the back of the room, has been leading a lot of our IoT efforts, and in particular, if you're interested in frameworks and certifications and those kinds of things, I suggest you talk to him. Robin Wilton has been doing a lot of our privacy work over the years. Jeff Wilbur does all of the OTA work and brought the OTA product into that, and a bunch of others. And finally, I just really wanted to use this picture. So if you have any questions. And I think I got you barely back on track.
Thank you so much, Karen.
Making IoT devices secure just feels like a heroic enterprise. Is there any work being done on trying to make networks?
I apologize.
I wonder whether the more value for money placed to target is actually networks, and some way that the network can recognize this thing and go, actually, you don't want it. It's not the network we would run.
No, it's not. But so to repeat the question, Andrew is saying that securing devices is a hopeless task. Heroic. Hey, they both start with H. Securing the networks, and maybe we should focus on securing the networks instead. I think I think a lot of what you're seeing is a lot of work to work on securing the networks. I think some of the things like operating wisely that's that whole category of things. Because I was specifically focusing on the OTA Trust Framework document, which is really device-focused, then I think that you'd see that. Some of the enterprise checklist, by the way, does have some specifics, some guidance for networks. So I think that you are right. I think it is going to be a challenge. And I also see securing devices to be a spectrum. It's sort of like, are we done? We're never going to be done. We're going to be moving forward. And I think we've learned a lot over the last few years. We've had a lot of really ugly, really public experiences. And we can only go forward.